They stood on the gallows, young women in SS uniforms, awaiting the final verdict of justice. The brutal executions of the female guards of Stutthof marked a chilling end to a chapter of horror few had anticipated. While male SS officers dominated Nazi terror, Stutthof revealed a darker truth. Women, too, had blood on their hands. Stutthof was more than a concentration camp. It was a killing site, a place where starvation, forced labor, and executions became routine. And among its most feared figures were women, female SS guards who beat, humiliated, and even selected prisoners for death with a terrifying sense of purpose. When the war ended, some of these women were tracked down and brought to trial. Their youth and gender did not save them. The world watched as they were publicly executed in 1946, sentenced not only for crimes against individuals, but for crimes against humanity. Stutthof was the first concentration camp established by the Nazis outside German borders and one of the last to be liberated. Located near Danzig, now Gdansk, Poland, it was initially set up in 1939 to detain Polish political prisoners. But as the war expanded, so did the camp's role, evolving from a local internment center into a major killing complex. By 1942, Stutthof had been absorbed into the broader Nazi concentration camp system. Gas chambers were installed, and the population of prisoners swelled. Jews, Soviet POWs, intellectuals, resistance members, and other undesirables were transported in from across Europe. Disease, starvation, and forced labor killed thousands, while executions, both systematic and arbitrary, were a daily reality. In total, more than 110,000 people passed through Stutthof's gates. Over 60,000 of them never left. Among the guards enforcing this regime of terror were dozens of women, many recruited during the camp's later years when SS manpower ran low. These female overseers would play key roles in the brutality that defined Stutthof's final phase. By the time Soviet troops arrived in early 1945, the camp had been largely evacuated. But the crimes committed within its fences would soon be exposed and prosecuted. The presence of female guards in Nazi concentration camps was not unusual by the later years of the war. But Stutthof was exceptional for the number of women who played direct and violent roles in the machinery of oppression. As the SS faced manpower shortages, women were increasingly recruited to serve as camp guards, known as Aufseherinnen. At Stutthof, these women were far from passive participants. Most were young, some in their early 20s, and came from ordinary German or Baltic backgrounds. They were trained at specialized SS facilities and quickly absorbed into the rigid hierarchy of camp life. Their primary duties included supervising female prisoner barracks, managing forced labor details, and maintaining discipline. In reality, many did far more. Eyewitness testimonies and trial records reveal that some of these women displayed a startling zeal for cruelty. They beat inmates with whips and sticks, enforced roll calls in freezing weather, and helped select prisoners for execution or death marches. Their authority was absolute, and their lack of mercy devastating. Unlike at larger camps, such as Auschwitz, where male SS officers often dominated, Stutthof's female guards took on more visible leadership roles. This allowed for a clearer picture of their individual actions and their willingness to embrace violence. By war's end, their names were known among survivors not just as figures of fear, but as symbols of betrayal. Women who had abandoned empathy in favor of brutality. When justice came, it would not overlook their gender. Among the female guards at Stutthof, a handful would be remembered not only for their cruelty, but for facing the ultimate consequence. These women were young, often smiling in photographs, but behind their ordinary appearances lay histories of violence and collaboration with atrocity. Jenny Wanda Barkman was just 24 when she was put on trial. Nicknamed the Beautiful Spectre by prisoners, Barkman was known for her striking looks and her vicious behavior. She joined Stutthof in 1944 and quickly gained a reputation for sadistic brutality. Survivors recounted how she would beat inmates unconscious and was present during selections for the gas chamber. Her calm demeanor in court stood in stark contrast to the horror described in testimonies. Found guilty, she was sentenced to death. Elizabeth Becker, also in her early 20s, trained at Stutthof and served from 1944 to early 1945. A stenographer before the war, she was pulled into the SS system and reportedly carried out her duties without question. Though she initially claimed minimal involvement, survivors pointed to her participation in selections and punishments. Her defense collapsed under witness accounts. She, too, was condemned to die. Gerda Steinhoff joined the SS as a guard after previously working as a tram conductor and nanny. By 1944, she had risen to the rank of Oberaufseherin, senior overseer. Described as confident and unrepentant, Steinhoff was directly implicated in numerous selections and acts of violence. In court, she maintained composure but expressed no remorse. Her actions and rank left no room for leniency. Wanda Claff, another young guard, stood out for her willingness to speak candidly about her involvement. During the trial, she admitted to slapping prisoners but claimed she was merely following orders. The court disagreed. Like the others, she was sentenced to death. These women were executed not for what they symbolized, but for what they had done with their hands, their words, and their unwavering loyalty to a genocidal system. The Stutthof trials, held in Gdansk in 1946, brought 13 former camp personnel to justice, including 5 female guards. The court proceedings lasted several weeks, filled with harrowing survivor testimonies and visual evidence of the atrocities committed at Stutthof. The charges ranged from physical abuse and torture to participation in mass murder through selections and forced labor. The court handed down 11 death sentences. Unlike many post-war executions that occurred behind prison walls, these were staged publicly, an intentional act of collective reckoning. The executions took place on July 4, 1946, at Biskupia Gorka, a hill overlooking the city. Thousands of Polish civilians gathered in silence to watch. The atmosphere was somber, not celebratory, a rare and haunting spectacle. One by one, the condemned were led to individual gallows constructed on wooden platforms. The female guards were not separated from the men. They stood as equals in the eyes of justice, stripped of their uniforms, but not of the memories they had left behind. Jenny Wanda Barkman, pale and shaking, had to be supported by guards as she ascended the steps. Gerda Steinhoff remained eerily composed, refusing to speak. Wanda Claff, who had confessed during the trial, is said to have muttered a prayer before the trapdoor opened beneath her feet. Elizabeth Becker, who had asked for clemency, was denied. There were no delays, no mercy. The executioner carried out each hanging with methodical precision. The crowd stood still, some crying, others grim. It was not just punishment, it was a public confrontation with the raw consequences of unchecked cruelty. The deaths of these women were brutal, yes, but also final. History had marked their names. Now justice had closed the chapter. The brutal executions of the female guards of Stutthof reverberated long after the gallows were dismantled. For many survivors and witnesses, the public hangings offered a rare sense of closure, a visible, tangible response to the invisible scars left by years of abuse and terror. Yet the legacy of these women and the system they served remained deeply complex. The executions forced a broader reckoning with the role of women in the Nazi system. These were not nameless bureaucrats or reluctant assistants. They were active participants in organized murder. For decades, however, mainstream narratives of the Holocaust tended to sideline female perpetrators, emphasizing male command structures and leadership. It was only through cases like Stutthof that the myth of female innocence in genocide began to unravel. Stutthof itself was eventually turned into a memorial site. Today, visitors walk through the remains of barracks, guard towers, and crematoria, guided by the echoes of testimony and the weight of history. But unlike Auschwitz or Dachau, Stutthof's place in public memory is often quieter, less prominent, yet equally chilling. As for the executed guards, their stories became symbols of justice served. Yet they also raised difficult questions. How does a young woman transform into a killer in uniform? How much of that responsibility lies in ideology, obedience, or ambition? These questions linger. And as the number of living survivors dwindles, the importance of remembering not only the crimes, but the accountability that followed grows heavier with each passing year. The brutal executions of the female guards of Stutthof closed one chapter of unimaginable cruelty, but they opened another. The confrontation with how ordinary people, especially women, could commit extraordinary evil. These weren't faceless monsters. They were nurses, clerks, shopgirls turned executioners in uniforms. Their downfall was public, their judgment absolute. Yet their legacy remains a warning. Justice was served, but the deeper lesson lies in understanding how easily brutality can be normalized when power goes unchecked and conscience fades. So we must ask, what leads a person to cross that final line between humanity and horror?